Our second section, we're going to look at intended outcomes and evaluation, and this is something that we typically tend to think of this last. To be honest, when I'm thinking about community groups and sessions, and perhaps the reason why I've put this a little bit further to the front is mainly because we've been doing a bunch of grant reports, and my realizing how critical it is that we give a really good sense of what our main objectives are to begin with, and we keep that in mind throughout the project. So oftentimes we'll think about that early on and then put it to the back of our minds until later. Now, some of our projects have been really successful at getting some good metrics out, either from quantitative sense of how many people were involved and what demographics did they represent, down to more qualitative things, which can often be more useful. What was it like for someone who may have been an isolated senior to have the opportunity to share their stories, or just to have people visit them, or to feel valued in their having their history to share. So those things can be very important. So first of all, let's talk about the kind of identifying your main objectives and how you might do that and how you think about that. Lisa, if you could lead the way on this one.
Yeah, sure. So I've got 3 projects that are sort of at the kicking off point at the moment. And all 3 of them are very much objective heavy by choice, just because I want to make sure that I keep my objectives in mind as I go along and plan things and plan events and go and engage with people, and I need to make sure that we actually get out of it what we said we would at the beginning of the project. Now, I can make this a bit more concrete. For our Sainsbury's project that I'm working on at the moment, some of our objectives are trying to minimize social isolation in some of the people that we're working with. Now, how are we going to do that? So you need to work through your log frame, or whatever you want to call it, your evaluation frame, and make sure that you actually plan your events in such a way that you can record whether they've actually minimized that social isolation. So what we're trying to do is go and visit some people in their homes who might not come along to the community events that the larger group is part of, and therefore then hopefully by visiting them at their homes, listening to their stories, recording their stories, hopefully with some other community people from the community there to listen to them and to encourage them, then hopefully we will improve some of their social exclusion in that way. And if you keep that in mind, then you can pull it through your entire events process and hopefully get a good outcome at the end that proves that you've actually made a difference, which is what we're trying to do. So,
Steve, how's this work for you?
I think certainly in terms of outcomes and objectives, it varies depending on whether I'm working with an existing group or trying to recruit a new one or create a new one. It's always far, far easier if you make those connections to work with existing groups from the outset, and far easier to know how many people will be involved, what you can deliver to them, what added value you can bring to their group as you go along. And I guess if you're creating a new group from scratch, it does have the bonus that you are, in a sense, looking to create new social connections that perhaps didn't exist before, perhaps between people that wouldn't have met before. But I'd always advise, where possible, going through those existing groups, scheduling enough time at the start of a program to have the chance to do so, and looking at what you can add to their regular meetings if possible. Yeah.
So how might you make that part of your objectives? Perhaps underlining how you are going to work with those groups, or what are your thoughts on that in terms of how you might, at the onset, make that a piece of what your work is going to deliver?
I'd be thinking in terms of certainly how many people you're going to engage, firstly, how you're going to engage them in practice in the room, and what it's going to bring in terms of added value to the regular meetings that they have between them. So if I try and think of perhaps a more concrete example, it could be that it's bringing new social connections between people. It could be that by sharing their memories in a group and their photographs within a group, that the group is starting to learn to get to know each other a little bit better. And it could be that by putting that on Historypin, it's giving them a legacy, I suppose, in order to continue contributing to that and to continue having that engagement, perhaps beyond the duration of the project as well. Equally, if you're able to recruit people from that group to run the sessions themselves, it could be that it's bringing new skills and new training to them, or digital literacy in order to do so.
So, Rebecca, with the Queens Neighborhood Stories bit, the part that I found helpful is you ended up with a matrix of responses from people, and we'll get into a little bit of how you gathered that information. But how were the objectives determined? I think for us it was a kind of a joint effort of figuring out what it is that was important for the Queensboro Library, as well as what it is that we wanted to accomplish. Can you add a little bit to how those objectives were defined?
Sure. So I think one of the things is thinking about what work you're already doing. Most organizations, groups already have objectives they want to meet. So take an example of a library running a digitization program. It might be about gathering a certain number of materials from the community over a period of time. And I think when you're doing a community engagement project or doing something slightly different, it gives you that space to think about, well, what else could our activity achieve? What other objectives might we want to add? So with Queens Neighborhood Stories, Queens Library had a great track record of collecting materials from the community, but there was also this question of how you could generate conversation through local history. How could the library help build social relationships and make history a sociable activity as well? So we started with the idea that we wanted to be running events, and we wanted one of the outcomes to be about people making connections and talking to other people, as well as sharing material with the library. And as Lisa, and I think you, John, touched upon, if you start with your objective, it means that you constantly come back to that, and you make sure that when you plan an event, you structure it around that. So if we wanted an event to be sociable, it meant it had to be at a time and a place where people could gather and meet. It needed a theme that people could identify with. It needed enough people to have a group conversation. That's very different to inviting an individual member of the community into the library with their photo album or to record their oral history. Similarly, it meant that we could set up evaluation questions that asked questions about the change that we wanted to see. So you could have evaluated the success of the project, which partly we did, by how many materials were shared, but that didn't give you any indication of the impact on the people who shared materials, or what other benefits were delivered. So by asking questions around, did you meet new people, did you enjoy it, would you come back again, did you meet someone from a different generation, that meant that we were gathering complementary ways of evaluating the success of the project and how we done in terms of making it more social. So whatever project activity you run, there'll always be different ways of structuring it, of marketing it, of giving a sense of what the purpose of the activity is. And if you're very focused on what your objective is, it means those things line up. And as John said, when you get to the end of it, you've got some data and material that may well support your assumption and the way that you ran your project. It may challenge it. You may not have succeeded in doing what you set out to do. It may get you to think that you might need to do things differently to achieve what you want to, and that's not a problem. I think setting up those questions is useful so that you can improve and adapt what you're doing. There is no one particular way of doing community engagement. It's always a learning experience. You're always working with different communities and different environments. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the structure that having a core objectives can give your activities.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add to that really briefly that it is, if at all possible, it's very important to just get a sense of what type of group you're going to meet with. Like, I have a lot of experience with meeting with small community groups, for example, and it helps a lot to kind of talk closely with the community leader and the person who organizes them to just get a sense of how big is the group, how comfortable are they talking with each other. Like from my experience, I've met with a group here in San Francisco that is super comfortable talking to each other. They meet every month, and they're comfortable just like kind of yelling things out and interrupting each other. And that's a hugely different type of environment, other than, as opposed to going to a group where they're not very comfortable and no one really knows each other. And that's kind of crucial. It is crucial to planning an event and kind of shaping your objective. Whereas, for example, if the group is hugely comfortable talking to each other, then your goal of having just people speak to each other and meet new people, that's kind of like, it would be different in that case.
So we've also touched on, I think I'm hearing a couple themes come out of this. One is, as you shape your objectives, you're building on knowing your audience a little bit. There's also an element here of iterating a bit, to kind of use a software analogy, but that you're making adjustments to how you're engaging with people as you go. And so part of that is in the evaluation itself and some of the mechanisms that we use to do that. I'm wondering if, I don't know who wants to jump in on this, but kind of talking about some of the different ways that you could do that, from surveys to exit interviews, things like that. What's worked for you all on that front?
I think I'd perhaps say at a basic level, making sure there's two people in the room is a great benefit if you're running any sessions, because then you're collecting material as you go along. When I say material, something as simple as a photograph of the session taking place can be great when it comes back to the evaluation stages. Something as simple as collecting names and email addresses, keeping good record of how many people have attended, and providing perhaps basic surveys to gather information and feedback as to their experience of the event, but just having that as you go along rather than getting to the end and trying to gather things together. And I think I'd add as well, from past experience, I had a previous role writing funding applications and evaluations, and it's always helpful to think, if you're new to it, in plain language. So thinking, what would success look like? How could I success? And often on a form it can be something that would be very simple and straightforward and similar to being in a room with someone explaining that success to them. So if writing and evaluating is new to you, think in terms of how would I explain this to someone in straightforward terms and build from there. That would be my approach to it.
That's really helpful. One of my questions, I guess, is follow-up to that, which I would give to anyone. But what are the tools that you've used? You kind of underlined the importance of making sure that you are keeping track of numbers and staying on top of that. Are there tools that you use that kind of help you to remind you to do that, or that you just kind of have a checklist that you're going through as you do events?
Yeah, I mean, events, before the event, I keep a list of resources, and I'll come back to it before, so I know I'm prepared for the event before I go. And just making sure you've got the lo-fi resources really at the event, so the paperwork for people to fill in and enough pens for people to do so, something as simple as that. And then when you come back, if you're able to and have resources, just scheduling in a bit of time so you're updating a spreadsheet continually and knowing that material's there to refer back to. Yeah, it can be tricky if things are busy, and obviously sometimes those events need to take precedence, but just keeping on top of that is very worth doing.
Yeah, and speaking to that, just in terms of kind of technically being able to balance recording data from a session and just being a host of an event and an MC, it helps hugely to coordinate with either the community leader or the program coordinator, kind of the person who's helping you to organize this event, to kind of assigned roles. For example, to have one person be the MC and steer the conversation, steer the gathering, and then to have another person kind of really recording everything that's going on. And especially for us, that's kind of recording our data, and what is happening is so hugely important. So I like to kind of take on that role and not put that on someone else. And so, and that in turn, it's helpful to assign the big kind of MC role outwards to another person, because it's very hard to do both.
Great. Any last thoughts on this section? I do want to keep moving on here, but anyone have anything else they want to add?
Just that paper's really important in the community. So having a sheet where people can sign their name, having printed evaluation forms that people are just checking off boxes that you're collecting there and then. To collect stuff later through digital surveys, you get very low response rates usually. Similarly, whatever you can do to lower the barrier to people filling something in is great, and that's the kind of most effective way of capturing their impressions in the moment rather than retrospectively.
Maybe I can add to that, maybe just talking to people like, okay, how did you enjoy the session? And then, you can, in that conversation, that's a quote. So then you can write that down afterwards and say, this participant said that they actually really enjoyed it, and they met some people that they didn't meet before, and they felt that they were more part of the community now. I mean, that's evaluation. It might not be on paper, but it is evaluation. So if you can write it down, if you remember it word for word and you can write it down, that's good.
All right, this is great, folks. I think kind of just underlining that having your objectives outlined, having a sense of how you're going to gather some of this information as you go, be willing to iterate and change your process, and having tools, both digital and analog, for recording these. And Rebecca makes a great point of how important that is to have paper and just to talk to people as well.